Hello everyone, my name's Katherine Weare and I'm the curator of this series of webcasts about contemplative education put together for Mind and Life Europe by those of us in the community of contemplative education. And you're joining me here for the third series, and this is my second talk in that series. And I'm going to be talking today about the role of mindfulness and contemplative approaches in addressing some of the big issues, the crises that are besetting the world. And this is part of the third series, which is about cutting edges and ways forward. We have several other excellent speakers for you to listen to, all of them in their own way talking about the role of contemplative education in the modern world. Orlaith O'Sullivan is talking about the Wake Up Schools programme, which was inspired by Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh and his work on engaged Buddhism, looking particularly at ethics and compassion. Mikkel Kristiansen is leading the Sea Learning programme, which was sponsored by the Dalai Lama, and also looks at compassion and ethics, and particularly integrating this work with social and emotional learning. And from Israel, Rony Berger talks about his work on overcoming prejudice and intolerance in Israel, in that very divided society, working with children through mindfulness and contemplative approaches. And Karlheinz Valtl reminds us of how we need to move upstream and make sure that we look after the well-being of the teachers, and is looking here particularly at how we need to start with initial teacher education. So I will be building on those talks. I'll also be building on the excellent work that you've heard already about the principles and implementation, but looking particularly at where we go from here. Well, Winston Churchill once said, "Never waste a good crisis," and we are not short of crises to choose from. We have the ecological crisis of climate chaos, climate change, an existential threat to our very existence. We have the long-term problems of social inequality, of racism, of poverty, which seem to be getting worse rather than better. We have mental health problems, dissociation, despair, disconnection, and a range of dangerous countercurrents which are making it ever harder for us to tackle these. We have a breakdown in what constitutes truth, lack of consensus. We have social fragmentation, polarisation. We've got the consequences of our own progress. The social media are very much a mixed blessing, and at the moment seem to be doing far more harm than good. And of course the usual long-term problems that have beset humanity through our very nature. Now there's a growing awareness that we in contemplative education need to articulate our relationship with all of this. And some would say, sadly, that we're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And the mindfulness criticism, which has been extended into schools, says that this is just stooges of the capitalist system, encouraging people to cope with uncopable levels of stress and feeding the corporate machine. And there's a critique around the work of mindfulness in schools, which makes the same points. The book I wrote with Thich Nhat Hanh, Happy Teachers Change the World, I read a scathing critique the other day of what a naive notion that is. Now, it's obviously not a view I share, or I wouldn't be talking to you here, but it is one that we need to be increasingly aware of, and I'm pleased to see that when I go on the websites of all our major organisations, Mind and Life Europe, the Mind and Life Institute, the Garrison Institute, the Mindfulness Initiative that I work for in the UK, Plum Village, other retreat centres, that there's increasing awareness of the need to articulate this relationship between what we're doing and social change. Talk of activism, talk of people becoming more engaged Buddhism, engaged practice. Running retreats for activists, having meetings which link activism with practice, it's all happening, and that's quite cheering. But there isn't much impulse for this coming from education itself, sadly. Education, I guess, tends to always be conservative, with a small c, to lag behind social change. So within the UK, for example, climate change is there on the agenda, but a very small part, and all about the evidence for it in science and geography, not linked up with civics or religious education or the arts. Black history isn't taught in schools in the UK. But there are opportunities for change, and I think we are seeing across Europe that some schools are making great strides. Teachers, after all, are first and foremost citizens who are as concerned about this as any of us. So we're starting to see some shifts where these things are becoming more on the agenda. And particularly cheering is the drive coming from young people themselves. The wonderful catalyst of Greta Thunberg's example. The school strikes for the climate, the German students who are insisting climate change be on their curricula. Young people themselves are going to be bearing the brunt of this, and they're waking up to ask what's being done about it, particularly in their education. And we owe it to these young people to ensure that we help them to tool up for this future that they're facing. We are seeing some excellent clear leadership from our global organisations. If you Google UNESCO, Education for the Futures, the World Economic Forum, they both have got exciting new agendas for what education needs to do to change, to teach the 21st century skills needed, all of which provide many opportunities for contemplative education. And growing awareness that we need what Zach Stein calls a new kind of human to tackle these problems. The historian Harari advises us, and I quote, in his excellent book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, "For every dollar and every minute we invest in improving artificial intelligence, it would be wise to invest $1 and a minute advancing human consciousness. If we're not careful, we will end up with downgraded humans misusing upgraded computers to wreak havoc on themselves and the world." So, real opportunities there for us to make the case for why we need contemplative education within all of this. And I will spend the rest of this talk just briefly outlining some key points that we may find helpful when we're needing to make this case. We're often asked, why do we include a focus on the inner life at all when the outer world is so pressing? Why do we practice? And I guess the simple answer is because we're all part of the world's problems and the solutions at both the micro and the macro level. And without inner change, if we change structures, we'll just reinvent the same human problems. And history shows us that time and again. The Russian Revolution leads to Stalinism. The Arab Spring creates chaos. It's human nature messing it up for us all unless we get a grip on that. So we need to give ourselves the tools to change this. And it's not a matter of willpower, it's a matter of skills and attitudes to cultivate the better sides of our natures. We've been looking at that right through this series, but just to look in a little more detail here at what the links are. Well, the work that we do of, acceptance and turning towards difficulty can help to maintain our openness towards the darker sides of our own natures, to face difficult and unacceptable sides to ourselves. And once we feel more comfortable with that, just acknowledging this is what humanity is like, it reduces our sense of us and them, moves us beyond simplistic attributions of good and evil. I'm, as many of you know, a great fan of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he has a very clear vision that we could all of us be anyone, evil or good, in the right or the wrong circumstances. And a lovely image of the mind as a seedbed containing all the dark and evil seeds and all the light and the optimistic, loving seeds. As he says, it depends which ones you water. So we need to water the good seeds in ourselves if we're going to make progress. But while acknowledging that these seeds of violence, destruction, hostility, greed, avarice are within all of us. This is a human problem. And at the same time, if we bring compassion to this process, we start to be able to do this without falling apart with self-blame and guilt and denial, feel more energized to be part of the solution. In the face of overwhelm, contemplative practice can build the ability to think more clearly. If we pay attention, we have a better ability to focus on what actually matters. If we stand back from our thoughts and emotions for a while, we can look more deeply with wisdom and discernment. We can get more insight into how our thoughts, our impulses are socially conditioned by our backgrounds, our age, our culture, our gender, our ethnicity. Helps us to tackle the modern problem of complexity, which befuddles many of us. It can help us handle but not be overwhelmed by the complexity of causes and solutions, and lead to greater insight and confidence to see ways forward. Gives us more subtle thinking. We stop thinking in such black and white ways and start to realise that all good impulses have their dark side, the law of unintended consequences, and so on. It can help us overcome this terrible crisis of disconnection between ourselves and others, between ourselves and nature. If we slow down and start savouring nature, for example, it can be deeply nourishing, and we really experience what Thich Nhat Hanh calls that sense of interbeing. And we need to love nature if we're going to preserve it. That famous naturalist, David Attenborough, was often criticised for showing beautiful documentaries of lovely animals and not talking enough about climate change and human degradation. He has changed that now big time. But even in those days, he would make a good case for saying people first have to love this stuff. If you don't love it, you won't protect it. So we need to savour this nature and the planet if we're going to hope to save it. And it builds our ability to work with others. If the us and them problem diminishes, we're more able to work together to build mindful, caring, active communities, including schools and universities. And we've covered that in some detail in our talks about whole school and whole university approaches. It can help us overcome the sense of despair and passivity and the sense of apparently overwhelming problems. This is particularly affecting the young who are going to need to live with this. And I'm very inspired by the quote of Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So we can encourage our young and ourselves to find things we ourselves can do right now, as well as looking at the big issues and using our vote wisely and protesting and complaining and doing everything we need to do. We can tackle what can be tackled in the here and now with a sense of agency and engagement. My colleague Jamie Bristow has written a magnificent document called Mindfulness, Developing Agency in Urgent Times. And I encourage you to go to the Mindfulness Initiative website. As he said, today's big problems are too complex for individuals to solve, and we need to find ways to distribute understanding and discerning collectively. Mindfulness can support the cognitive infrastructures required to handle complexity in teams, reduce barriers to collaboration. So with more mindfulness, we work together more effectively. And I'm very much looking forward to the upcoming talk by Matthew Ricard on the Mind and Life website about the need for altruism in society, to recognise and value every single living being on the planet as worthy of our respect and care. So, in summary, what have I been arguing? Well, we don't need to dispute that we're in crisis. And I hope we don't need to dispute that we need contemplative education to step up and make a case for itself, particularly at a time when conventional education is not taking as much cognizance of this as perhaps it should. We can build on what we're already doing within mainstream education and use new opportunities like global agencies, UNESCO, the World Economic Forum and their new agendas. And the mobilisation of the young, we can perhaps follow that rather than lead. There is a strong case for the contemplative. The inner and outer life are one. Inner and outer transformation require each other. Through practice, we start to realise that we're part of the problem, not separate from it, and that we have a common humanity and a common responsibility. We are able to engage in better quality thinking, more critical thinking, have more confidence to act intentionally and effectively, and work more effectively with others. Because in the end, I think we might all agree we're trying to join together to realise a vision of education which is about a great deal more than the individual. Thich Nhat Hanh puts it beautifully when he says, our mission is not just to transmit knowledge, but to form human beings, to construct a worthy, beautiful human race in order to take care of each other and our precious planet. So I leave you with that thought and look forward to hearing any comments or suggestions you have in the webinar that will follow this series. Thank you very much for your attention.